So my name is Scott. I am very pleased to announce, I can finally announce it publicly. I'm the new Church of Ireland chaplain for UCD. So I'm looking forward to kicking off that in the next few weeks. And it's been a really exciting journey that's led me here. And I think one of the big parts of that journey has been doing, over the last 3 years in particular, where I've found myself, in freelance ministry, unemployed. And it's what I jokingly call my friends two white coats ministry. The first white coat is kind of like the white coat of the mad scientist who's like just trying out like these crazy things in his lab to try and figure out something that will work, something that has the potential to transform changing Ireland as we try to figure out what does it mean to follow Jesus today in our ever-changing society. It doesn't look what it looked like. It shouldn't look like what it looked like in the past. So what is it going to look like? And how can it not be defined by not being like these other things, but instead be defined by values that we carry as part of our DNA as we try to live out what it means to be authentically and indigenously Irish, rather than importing what it means to be Christian from places elsewhere. So as part of that, one of those journeys has been to start a podcast. Oh, sorry, let me go back there. With my friends Greg Fromholz and Alan Breen. There's a joke among missionaries in Ireland that Ireland is a missionary graveyard. So we decided to call the podcast The Graveyard Shift because we've been sticking at it for long enough. And it's just an hour-long conversation about faith and life and whatever else. We play the greatest game ever. It's a quiz called the Sun Direction Quiz, where I read out a lyric and the lads have to tell me whether it's from a worship song or a One Direction lyric. Always great fun. And the other thing that we do is we do a segment called Not Sponsored By, which is this joke where we take some ridiculous Christian merchandise that people are flogging on the internet and we talk about it and expose what's behind there, and then we talk about articles that fascinate us. And it's just a conversational thing. And we were like, well, sure, we'll just do it and we'll stick it up on iTunes. And it's been, we've had 5,000 listens since March, and we've invested about €1,000 in it and many hours. But we have a regular listenership of about 300 people a week. That's more than most churches tuning in purposely across the world to listen to something, because these are the opportunities in our world today. And the other thing I'm doing is a thing called the Revelectionary blog, where we're trying to blog through the lectionary and raise up students who will write about the weekly passages that the church looks at. And the question is not how do we just create resources, but how do we make our young adults resource creators, apologists, people who exegete the text and find out how to apply it to their lives and share it with their friends. There's all these new possibilities. And one of these possibilities that we've been exploring over the last couple of years is paradoxology. In 2013, Pamela Rooney came to myself and to Greg Fromholz and asked, do you think it would be possible for us to do a Christian sacred space at Electric Picnic, Ireland's biggest music and arts festival? And Greg and I had talked about this in the past and whether or not that would be possible. And so we started banding it around, and Pamela got in touch with the festival, and we started putting together an ethos and thinking, well, how would this work? What would it actually look like? And so in naming it, we took two words, paradox, two things that at first glance cannot both be true, and yet they are, and doxology, a liturgical formula of praise to God. We put those two things together to form our name, which is the idea of the glory of God being found in mystery, and the truth being found in not knowing and not having all the answers. And so we gathered together a team, and we approached Electric Picnic, and we said, we'd love to run a Christian prayer tent, And they're like, cool. And we were like, oh, we didn't think we'd get this far. And so we put up a mood board and started, we presented this to them. We had these different ideas. And to our surprise, they said yes. And so we gathered a team together of young adults who are passionate about their faith and passionate about expressing that faith through love for people. And we moved out into the picnic. So next slide there. We created these signs, and this quote from Julian of Norwich really summed up what we were trying to do. In our eyes, we are always falling. In God's eyes, we are always standing. Both are true, but God has the greater insight. And we wanted to sit in that tension, not declaring what other people need to be, but instead wrestling with the not knowing and with the tension of what it means to be loved by God and yet to struggle. And so we started handing out free tea and coffee, and the idea was the only way you could pay for our tea and coffee was by doing a random act of kindness for someone else. And so the verses on the coffee cup say, they're from Romans. I think we have a slide there. Oh, outdo one another in showing kindness and honor. And so the idea was to, instead of creating a competition for the most artistic or the coolest or the most hipster or the best beard, which of course I'd win, the question was, how can we create a culture of trying to outdo one another in acts of honor, of paying kindness forward through the festival? And we had one of our two of our young lads build a confessional, and the confessional originally was a place where someone could come in and they could sit and they could just talk and get stuff off their chest, and one of our team members would listen and silently pray for them, and that worked really well the first year. But then, as we were evolving and understanding, one of our friends who was on the team recognized, well, what if we don't have the capability to deal with what someone's talking about? And we realized this was a beautiful idea, but perhaps badly lived out, because if someone talked about something that we couldn't deal with, or that we couldn't actually care for them for, that could actually have negative consequences for them. So it was this beautiful, lovely idea, but then when we wrestled with the grit of it, we were like, well, it isn't actually enough. It doesn't care for them. So this evolved, and it became a prayer box. And we created an altar where people could leave things behind. And I remember this moment of one of our guys telling us about someone who had come into the tent, and he'd been there on the Friday, and he came back on Sunday night, and he asked one of our guys, is the altar still open? And he was like, yeah, we don't close it. Did you have something you wanted to write down? And he said, no, I didn't want to write something down. He pulled a betting slip out of his pocket. And he said, I don't know whether this bet has won or lost. I just know that this is ruining my life. And he went and he put it on the altar. And the idea that someone had explained what the altar was to him on Friday, and for 48 hours throughout the festival, throughout all of his different experiences, everything he'd heard, everyone he'd met, this kept nagging at him. And he came back to our sacred space to give it away as a silent prayer to God, to say, I don't know who you are, but please help me in the midst of this. The idea that we could create a space like that was so powerful. And we created a prayer tree with this idea of how do we, so many of us are touched by issues of mental health, and people who are struggling with mental health issues. And so people could come in and write down the name of a person or a prayer, and they could tie it up on the tree. And suddenly this tree that had leaves on it was begin to fill with these labels that had names and prayers of people as they gathered together in the middle of this festival to remember those that they were struggling with and to pray for people. We put out coloring books, which has become this new trend, but some have been saying, some of the research points to coloring books being as powerful as meditation, in learning to settle your heart and hear what's really going on within yourself, in the hope that that's perhaps where God could meet you. And we twinned our tent with what's happening in the refugee camps, and we, through Tier Fund, are doing a tent twinning initiative. And they've raised thousands and thousands of pounds through Christian festivals where people would twin their tent with tents of refugees who are fleeing the conflict in Syria. And so we twinned our tent. We made it a place where people could actually drop their leftover tents and bedding to be taken from Electric Picnic to Calais, where refugees are living there with nothing. We became a place where people could also give. There's this beautiful experiment. 41,000 people go to Electric Picnic every year. That's about 1% of the Irish population. And in the minds of so many, it's, and so many of us who, and I count myself among this, who can tend to be judgmental in the church, be like, oh, that's a terrible place. They're all sinning up there, they're all going off to lose their minds. And instead, we're not asking the question, if 1% of our population is showing up there, and it is the cutting edge of cultural, artistic, and musical expression in our country, why are we not there? And why are we not there? Not to have our voice heard, but to hear people's voices, to create a space for those voices. Not necessarily the voices that get microphones, but the voices of those who might be lost in the wilderness of that forest. Lost in the wilderness of being lonely, even in company. Creating a listening ear where people can be heard, be known, and be loved. In our first year, we were kind of surprised we even got there. And Electric Picnic gave us 12 tickets. And then the following year, they gave us 20 tickets. And this year, they gave us 20 tickets and €500 towards our cost. Because as we continue to develop our mission to love people in the wilderness, As much as the church finds it baffling, Electric Picnic are like, take my money. Go serve. Create a space for people. Because when we live out the gospel well, it's not just good news for us, it's good news for everyone. One of my favorite, one and a half quick stories. One of my friends moved in with a new housemate recently, and she was talking to me. She was saying, "I'm going off to Electric Picnic," and her housemate was saying to her, "I'm going off to Electric Picnic," and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm going as well. Have you been before?" And he's like, "Yeah, no, I loved it." And she's like, "Oh, what was your favorite thing about it?" And he'd been to the gigs, and he'd been out camping, he'd been there with friends. And he said, "Well, on one of the days, we were walking out through the woods, through this forest trail, and we found this little tent. And in there was a bunch of people serving tea and coffee and talking to people about God." Now, normally I wouldn't be into that kind of shite. But I came in, and a guy with a big beard gave me a cup of tea, and he sat me and my friends down. And we just had the most amazing conversation. I don't know, I'd say that was the highlight of Electric Picnic for me. Or maybe it was the pills. And you know what? That's the tension of mission and the beauty of mission in Ireland today.